The sound wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't the crash of breaking glass or the thud of a fist against skin. It was something worse. The soft crack of a telephone receiver against a man's head. They say Dean Martin's 49th birthday party was amazing. They say the champagne flowed until sunrise. They say the laughter echoed through the Polo Lounge like music. They say everyone went home smiling. But the man on the floor wasn't smiling. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing right. And the telephone, pink fancy, the kind they put on every table for Hollywood's rich and famous, was covered in blood. They didn't call the police. They didn't call an ambulance. They didn't look back. They just left. Someone whispered 5 words that night. 5 words that would never appear in any police report, any newspaper, any biography. Let's get out of here, Frank. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be erased from history. Almost. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the Polo Lounge in 1966. The Beverly Hills Hotel had been Hollywood's living room for decades. Stars checked in under fake names. Deals were made over breakfast. Affairs began and ended between meals. But the Polo Lounge was different. The Polo Lounge was the throne room. Green leather booths lined the walls. Soft lighting made everyone look 10 years younger. Waiters who had served Gable, Bogart, and Monroe glided between tables with practiced silence. And on every table sat a pink telephone. Not for decoration, but for power. Studio heads closed contracts on those phones. Agents stole clients during meals. Lovers arranged secret meetings while their spouses sat across the table. In the Polo Lounge, the telephone wasn't just convenient. It was a symbol, a weapon, a reminder that in this room, anything could happen. And on June 8, 1966, 2 of the most powerful men in Hollywood sat at their usual booth. Frank Sinatra. Dean Martin. The untouchables. The men who made careers with a nod and destroyed them with a glance. It was Dean's 49th birthday. The champagne was flowing. The laughter was loud. But one man wasn't laughing. Franklin H. Fox, a businessman from New York, was sitting 2 tables away. He had come to Beverly Hills for a quiet dinner. He didn't know Frank Sinatra. He didn't know Dean Martin. He didn't know that in 15 minutes he would witness something that would follow him to his grave. The party had been going for 2 hours when Frederick Rand Wiseman decided he'd had enough. Wiseman was 54 years old. Former president of Hunt Foods. Brother-in-law to Norton Simon, one of the richest men in California. He collected art. He attended charity galas. He sat on boards and shook hands with senators. And he considered himself a man of culture, a man of class, a man who didn't tolerate rudeness. And the noise from Sinatra's booth was rude. The laughter wasn't just loud. It was aggressive. Jilly Rizzo's booming voice. Richard Conte's barking laugh. Women giggling at jokes Wiseman couldn't hear, but could imagine. And above it all, Sinatra. Always Sinatra. Holding court like a king who had forgotten that other people existed. Wiseman tried to ignore it. He focused on his dinner companion. He sipped his wine. He reminded himself that these were powerful men, dangerous men, men you didn't confront in public. He had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. Sinatra's temper. Sinatra's connections. The rumors about who he knew and what they could do. But 10 minutes became 15. 15 became 20. And with each passing minute, the laughter grew louder. The jokes grew cruder. And Wiseman's patience grew thinner. His dinner companion leaned across the table. Fred, don't. It's not worth it. But Wiseman was already standing. Wiseman didn't see the danger. He didn't read the room. He didn't notice Jilly Rizzo's hand moving under the table. He didn't know that in 5 minutes he would be on the floor. He didn't announce himself. He didn't clear his throat or wait for a pause in the conversation. He just walked to Sinatra's booth and stood there. His shadow falling across the table like a judgment. Frank looked up. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked the way a cat looks at a mouse that has wandered too close. You talk too loud, Wiseman said. His voice was steady, controlled. The voice of a man who was used to boardrooms and negotiations, not bar fights in back alleys. Some of us are trying to have a civilized dinner. The table went quiet. Jilly Rizzo's hand stopped halfway to his glass. Richard Conte's smile froze on his face. The women looked down at their plates. But Dean didn't move. Dean didn't speak. Dean just watched with those half-closed eyes. The eyes that always looked sleepy, but never missed anything. Frank leaned back in his chair. "What did you say?" "I said you talk too loud. You and your Dago friends." The word hung in the air like a knife. Dago. Franklin Fox, 2 tables away, felt his hand freeze around his whiskey glass. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal. The sound was way too loud in the sudden silence. He had heard stories about Sinatra. Everyone in America had heard stories. The fights. The feuds. The men who had crossed him and disappeared from Hollywood forever. But Fox had never seen it in person. He had never seen that look in a man's eyes. The look that said something terrible was about to happen. And nothing in the world could stop it. "Frank." Dean's voice was barely a whisper. "Let it go." But Frank didn't let things go. Frank never let things go. "You want to say that again?" Frank's voice was quiet, almost gentle, conversational. The most dangerous voice Dean Martin had ever heard. Dean knew that voice. He had heard it in Steubenville. In the back rooms of illegal casinos. In the alleys behind speakeasies where men settled arguments with fists and bottles. And worse. He had heard it before 100 fights. He had heard it before blood was spilled. But this wasn't Steubenville. This was Beverly Hills. This was the Polo Lounge. And in Beverly Hills, the weapons were different. The consequences were different. The cover-ups were more expensive. Wiseman didn't back down. His face was red. His hands were clenched at his sides. He had money. He had power. He had connections that stretched from California to Washington. He had never backed down from anyone in his life. "You heard me," Wiseman said. "You wops think you own this town. You don't own anything. You're just loud, vulgar, greasy." He didn't finish the sentence. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. But it would take 30 years to cover up. The first punch came fast. Later, no one would agree on who threw it. The police reports would list unknown assailant. The newspaper articles would say a scuffle broke out. The biographies written decades later would hedge with phrases like allegedly and reportedly and according to some witnesses. But Franklin Fox saw it. He saw everything. Sinatra moved first. His right hand came up from the table. Not a wild swing, but a sharp, precise jab that caught Wiseman square on the jaw. The sound was wet, meaty. The sound of bone against bone. Wiseman stumbled backward. His arm caught a champagne bucket. Ice and water and a bottle of Dom Perignon exploded across the floor. Crystal glasses shattered against marble. A woman screamed. A short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the chaos. But Wiseman didn't fall. He caught himself on a chair. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. And then he did something that surprised everyone. He swung back. It was a wild punch, desperate. The punch of a man who had never been in a real fight. Who had never felt his knuckles connect with another man's face. Who had spent his whole life paying other people to handle problems like this. It missed Sinatra by 6 inches. But it didn't miss the table. Wiseman's fist crashed into a tray of glasses. More crystal shattered. Champagne sprayed across white tablecloths. And now Jilly Rizzo was standing. And Richard Conte was standing. And the booth had become a battlefield. Dean grabbed Frank's arm. "Let's get out of here, Frank." His voice was calm, steady. The voice of a man who had seen too many fights end badly. Too many nights turn into disasters. Too many good times turn into tragedy. But Frank wasn't listening. Frank never listened when the rage took over. Not when someone had called him that word. Not when someone had insulted him in front of his friends, his women, his whole court of admirers. Not when someone had made him feel like the poor Italian kid from Hoboken again. Another punch. Wiseman's head snapped back. He crashed into a table. Not his own, but the one behind him. The one where a retired film producer and his wife were celebrating their anniversary. More screams. More shattering glass. The retired producer grabbed his wife and pulled her toward the exit. Franklin Fox should have run. He should have stood up and walked out and pretended he had seen nothing. That's what everyone else was doing. The Polo Lounge was emptying fast. Hollywood people knew when to disappear. Knew when to develop sudden amnesia. Knew when being a witness was worse than being a suspect. But Fox couldn't move. Couldn't look away. Couldn't stop watching the nightmare unfold. Wiseman tried to stand. Blood was running from his nose. From a cut above his eye. From somewhere in his scalp. His expensive suit, hand-tailored, probably cost more than most people made in a month, was torn at the shoulder. His silk tie was spotted with red. But he wasn't finished. He lunged forward, his hands reaching for Sinatra's throat. And then someone grabbed the telephone. It was pink, elegant. The kind of phone that sat on every table in the Polo Lounge. A playful prop for the powerful. A toy for the elite. A status symbol wrapped in pale rose plastic. It wasn't playful anymore. The receiver came down once. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the crack of a gunshot or the crash of breaking furniture. It was just final. A dull, wet thud that cut through the chaos like a whisper through a scream. The sound of something ending. The sound of a line being crossed that could never be uncrossed. Wiseman's body hit the floor. The waiters didn't move. The busboys didn't intervene. The other guests didn't call for help. In the Polo Lounge, you didn't see things. You didn't hear things. You didn't remember things. That was the price of admission. He didn't get up. He didn't call for help. He didn't reach for the table or try to steady himself. He didn't curse or moan or cry out. He just lay there, surrounded by broken crystal and spilled champagne and overturned chairs. His eyes were open. His mouth was moving. But the only sound coming out was a wet rattling snore. The snore of a man whose brain was bleeding. The snore of a man who was dying. Franklin Fox felt his throat close. Felt his hands go numb. Felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest. The knowledge that he had seen something he could never unsee. Something that would follow him for the rest of his life. The telephone receiver lay on the floor next to Wiseman's head. Pink plastic. Elegant design. Covered in blood. Dean's hand was on Frank's shoulder. "Let's get out of here, Frank," he whispered. "Now." This time, Frank listened. Dean had seen men fall before. In Steubenville. In the steel town where he grew up. Men fell all the time. They fell in bar fights and card games and back alley disagreements over money and women and insults that no one would remember the next morning. But those men got up. They wiped the blood off their faces and ordered another drink and laughed about it the next day. They wore their scars like medals. They told the stories at parties. This man wasn't getting up. This man wasn't going to laugh about anything. This man might never wake up. Frank and Dean left through separate exits. Sinatra went out the back. Through the kitchen. Past the dishwashers who would later claim they saw nothing. Dean went out the front. Nodding to the maitre d' like it was any other night. Like his best friend hadn't just put a man in the hospital. Within the hour, they were gone from Los Angeles entirely. Nothing happened, Sinatra whispered to his lawyer the next morning. The man fell. That's all anyone needs to know. A private pilot named Clay Lacey picked him up at a small airfield outside the city. He would later tell investigators that Frank's arm was in a makeshift sling. Dean's left eye was bruised and swollen. Neither man spoke during the flight. Neither man explained where they were going or why they had to leave so fast. But Frederick Wiseman wasn't flying anywhere. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes after the fight ended. They found Wiseman unconscious on the floor of the Polo Lounge, surrounded by broken glass and overturned furniture, and a telephone receiver that someone had carefully wiped clean. His pulse was weak. His breathing was shallow. His pupils were different sizes. They rushed him to Cedars-Sinai. The doctors examined him, found no obvious skull fracture, and admitted him for observation. By midnight, he was awake. By morning, he was asking for breakfast. The doctors called his wife and told her the crisis had passed. They were wrong. 2 days later, Wiseman collapsed in his living room. Emergency surgery revealed what the initial examination had missed. A fractured skull. A subdural hematoma. Bleeding deep in the brain that had been slowly building pressure for 48 hours. For 3 hours, surgeons worked to save his life. For 3 weeks afterward, his family held vigil at his bedside, waiting to see if he would ever wake up. He woke up, but he didn't remember. The doctors called it retrograde amnesia, complete memory loss of the hours surrounding the trauma. Wiseman remembered arriving at the Polo Lounge. He remembered ordering a whiskey sour. He remembered seeing Sinatra's table across the room. But he didn't remember the confrontation. He didn't remember the insult. He didn't remember the first punch or the second or the third. He didn't remember the telephone. He didn't remember anything that mattered. Frank called it luck. The police investigation went nowhere. Sinatra was questioned twice. He denied throwing any punches. He denied being present when Wiseman fell. He denied knowing anything about any telephone. And without Wiseman's testimony, without the victim's memory, there was nothing to prosecute. But the Wiseman family wanted justice. For weeks, they talked about pressing charges. They talked about civil lawsuits. They talked about going to the press and exposing Sinatra for what he was. Frederick's brother-in-law, Norton Simon, had money and connections and lawyers who could make things very uncomfortable for a singer from Hoboken. And then suddenly, they stopped talking. No charges were filed. No lawsuit was pursued. No interviews were given. When journalists called the Wiseman home, the housekeeper said the family had no comment. When biographers dug into the case years later, they found sealed records and missing police reports. And witnesses who had developed sudden amnesia of their own. Franklin Fox was asked about that night exactly once. A reporter tracked him down in 1978. 12 years after the incident. Fox said he couldn't remember the details. He said it was a long time ago. He said he had probably had too much to drink. He was lying. But some lies are safer than the truth. And some silences are paid for. 3 weeks after the Polo Lounge incident, Frank Sinatra bought an engagement ring. $85,000. 9 carats. A diamond so big it looked fake. He was getting married to Mia Farrow. A woman 30 years younger. A woman closer in age to his own children than to him. A woman who had been a child star when Frank was already a legend. And Dean Martin got the thankless task of breaking the news. He didn't complain. He didn't refuse. He didn't ask why Frank couldn't make the calls himself. Why Frank couldn't face his own children. Why Frank always needed someone else to clean up the messes and deliver the bad news. He just picked up the phone. He called Nancy Jr. and told her. He called Frank Jr. and told him. He called Tina and told her too. He told them their father was getting married today right now. And no, they weren't invited to the ceremony. Because that's what friends do. They stand in the gap. They make the calls no one else wants to make. They keep the secrets no one else can keep. Frederick Wiseman lived. He recovered. He went back to collecting art and attending charity galas and sitting on boards. He went back to his life as if that night had never happened. Because for him, it hadn't. It was a blank space in his memory. A void where 3 hours used to be. He died in 1994 at 82 years old. Peacefully in his sleep. He never remembered the Polo Lounge. He never remembered what he said to Sinatra. He never remembered the telephone. But the Polo Lounge remembers. They still have pink telephones. They sit on every table just like they did in 1966. Elegant, playful props for the powerful. Toys for the elite. But if you sit at table 12, if you know the history, if you know where to look, you might notice that the surface isn't quite smooth. There are scratch marks in the wood. Faint grooves where something heavy was dragged across the finish. Where a telephone became a weapon. Where a birthday party became a crime scene. Where Hollywood learned once again that some men were untouchable. Power isn't about money. It isn't about fame. It isn't about how loud you can laugh or how hard you can punch or how many people fear your name. Power is about who cleans up after you. And who stays silent. Remember the pink telephone. Remember the man who fell. Remember the friend who whispered, "Let's get out of here, Frank."